Studying the history of the Soviet automotive industry through the biographies of engineers, factory directors, and ministers often leads to unexpected discoveries. While in capitalist countries a new car model was usually an attempt by manufacturers to respond to market demand, in the Soviet Union, cars appeared according to a completely different logic. Quite often, the fate of an entire project depended on the decision of a single person, who could either launch development or shut it down entirely and without appeal. Personal influence also played a major role. Whether an engineer held the right position, worked at the right factory, or had enough authority to push decisions through government ministries, often determined whether a project lived or died. One such engineer was Andrei Lipgart, a man responsible for many well-known vehicles produced by the Gorky automobile plant under the Gaz brand. However, when it came to one of the factory's most famous cars, the Volga, the story took an unexpected turn. The Gaz 21 Volga appeared thanks to Lipgart, but not because he was working at the factory at the time, rather because by then he was no longer there, and not by his own choice. I think everyone is familiar with the cooperation between the USSR and Italian engineers, and with the construction of the giant automobile plant in the city of Togliatti, named after an Italian communist. But a much less known fact is this: the Lada plant was not the Soviet Union's first experience of that kind. The first partners were Americans, and this happened long before the start of World War II. It is no secret that the Russian Empire, and later the early USSR, were predominantly agrarian societies with low levels of mechanization and a very weak industrial base. In the late 1920s, the Bolsheviks proclaimed a simple and blunt slogan: "We can no longer live off the field, the horse, and manual labor. We need factories, machinery, energy, and mass production." This marked the beginning of what became known as industrialization, a large-scale construction of factories, plants, power stations, railroads, and ports. It was not a modernization of what already existed, but a forced creation of industry almost from scratch. Agriculture ceased to be the main priority, and industry moved to the forefront. A massive outflow of peasants from villages and rural areas began as cities offered large amounts of new, and most importantly, paid, work. Some cities were literally built from the ground up as part of this process. Industry required not just retraining, but essentially educating former peasants from the very beginning. In simple terms, industrialization was an attempt by the Soviet Union to cover in a single generation a path that had taken other countries more than a century. Was this attempt successful? That question remains highly debatable. On the one hand, entire industrial sectors emerged that simply did not exist before. The country made a rapid transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial one. By the 1960s, illiteracy had been almost completely eliminated, and high-technology industries and complex manufacturing had appeared. On the other hand, industrialization was carried out at extreme speed, with local mismanagement and, at times, tragic consequences. The rural population suffered the most. In many cases, payments to foreign partners, directly or through the export of agricultural products for hard currency, were effectively made at the expense of the countryside. This was especially true of American companies and specialists, who played a major role in helping to build industrial facilities in the Soviet Union. One of those facilities was the Gorky automobile plant. The Soviet Union had an acute need for trucks, buses, and passenger cars, for construction projects, the military, and collective farms. But above all, it needed its own automotive industry. Not small, semi-handcrafted workshops, but large-scale, stable, mass production. The Soviets, of course, had no independent school of automotive engineering at the time. So a highly pragmatic decision was made to acquire a complete factory in the West, including assembly lines, technologies, and all necessary equipment. In essence, the idea was to purchase an automotive industry outright. In 1929, a contract was signed between the Soviet government and the Ford Motor Company. It included turnkey factory design, the supply of all equipment and technical documentation, training of Soviet engineers in the United States, and licenses for two vehicles, the Ford A passenger car and the Ford AA truck. Construction of the plant began in 1930 in the city of Nizhny Novgorod. which was soon renamed Gorky. This is where the name Gorky Automobile Plant comes from. The scale of the project was enormous. Dozens of workshops were built, along with a power station, a railway connection, and housing for future workers. Around 40,000 people took part in the construction, including approximately 150 American specialists. The pace was extreme. Work continued around the clock, often without proper machinery, largely by hand. This was a shock construction project, far removed from propaganda posters. Cold, injuries, shortages, and extremely harsh working conditions accompanied the process throughout. Nevertheless, on January 1st, 1932, the plant became operational, and the first Ford A cars, now renamed Gaz A, rolled off the assembly line. Problems were inevitable at the beginning: low production culture, quality and assembly issues, and dependence on American components. But the factory was running, and that was the key point. Henry Ford deserves special mention here. As the owner and head of the company, he personally approved cooperation with the Soviet Union. Ford openly despised communism as an ideology, yet spoke very positively about the large-scale engineering projects underway in the USSR. And above all, he remained a businessman. For him, this was a major commercial deal, not a political gesture. In essence, a man with strongly anti-communist views sold technology to the Soviet Union, trained its engineers, and helped lay the foundation of its automotive industry. The cost of the project, in 1929 prices, was estimated at $30 to $35 million, roughly $500 to $600 million in today's terms. And this figure covers only the contract itself, excluding the construction of the factory, infrastructure, and housing. At the very moment the plant was only beginning to take shape, a young engineer named Andrei Lipgart asked to be transferred there. At the time, he was working at the National Automotive and Engine Institute in Moscow. Things moved quickly for him at the new place. By 1933, Andrei Lipgart had become the chief designer of the Gorky automobile plant. He is widely credited with building a strong in-house engineering school there, selecting his team strictly on professional merit rather than background or personal connections. Even during the harshest Stalin-era years, Lipgart appointed engineers with questionable social origins, politically risky biographies, and even foreign nationals. He entrusted them with tasks considered strategically important for national defense, without hesitation. Naturally, Soviet engineers looked to the Americans for reference. At the time, the United States had arguably the most advanced automotive industry in the world, and the plant itself was built largely following American principles. So this orientation should come as no surprise. Among Lipgart's well-known projects was the Gaz M1, often described as a copy of a Ford, and formally the license for it was indeed transferred as part of the original contract. However, the extent of redesign and adaptation to Soviet conditions makes it clear that this was not a simple copy, but an independent engineering project, even if its exterior closely resembled the American original. The Gaz 11 engine, developed under the same team, was a different story altogether. It was an unlicensed copy of the American Dodge D5 engine. In general, Andrei Lipgart consistently advocated borrowing Western experience and technology, and not always through formal licensing. For this, he was often criticized by his contemporaries. But at the same time, he faced a very concrete task: to provide the country with modern automotive technology. And Lipgart approached that task in the way he believed was most effective. Unfortunately, accusations of plagiarism also followed Lipgart's most famous creation, the Gaz M20 Pobeda. The myth that Pobeda was supposedly a copy of the Opel Capitan has become so deeply rooted that disproving it is not easy. But let's try. The origin of this myth is easy to understand. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union gained access to Opel's factories, technical drawings, and engineering solutions. The production line for the Opel Kadett was dismantled and completely transported to the Soviet Union, where it later became the basis for Moskvich cars, essentially Opels with a different badge. However, the assembly line for the larger Capitan model was never dismantled or transferred to the USSR. It is worth noting that Opel Capitan itself is sometimes accused if not of outright plagiarism, then at least of consciously borrowing ideas from across the Atlantic. Opel actively drew on American automotive experience, particularly that of GM, with which the company maintained close ties. As for the elements the Capitan and Pobeda genuinely had in common, these included the front suspension and a number of individual engineering solutions. They also shared a broadly similar exterior styling, although this was typical of many cars of the era and hardly unique. In the end, Pobeda was not a copy of any single foreign model. It was a complex blend of American design trends, studied German experience, and original Soviet engineering solutions. The name Pobeda translates as victory, although the car was originally meant to be called Rodina, motherland. At first glance, it seemed like a perfectly fitting patriotic name, but it was precisely this name that led to a revealing incident. As mentioned earlier, the final decision on whether a new car would enter mass production was made personally by Stalin. Prototype vehicles were presented to him, and he would decide their fate. The same was true for the car that Andrei Lipgart presented under the name Rodina. Stalin generally liked the car, but instead of giving immediate approval, he asked a single question. "So, how much are you planning to charge for the motherland?" The meaning was clear without further explanation. By the next public presentation, the car had been renamed Pobeda, Victory, and under that name, it entered mass production. Overall, Lipgart's career developed successfully, and he was even awarded the Stalin Prize, which, in the Soviet Union of that era, meant a great deal. However, in 1951, a difficult period began for Andrei Lipgart. The reason was a project that came from NAMI, the institute where Lipgart himself had worked before moving to Gorky. The factory received documentation for an amphibious vehicle designated 011, based on the components of the outdated Gaz 67, which was already scheduled to be phased out of production. Shortly afterward, an official order followed to begin serial production of this amphibious vehicle, with the armed forces as the primary customer. For Lipgart and his engineering team, these plans came as no surprise. They had anticipated this scenario and had prepared their own alternative in advance, the Gaz 46 amphibian. It served the same purpose and met the same requirements, but was based on the more modern and promising Gaz 69 platform. The vehicle still required further development, but the logic was clear. The military would receive a more modern vehicle, even if with a delay of 1 or 2 years, while the factory would avoid keeping obsolete Gaz 67 components in production and investing resources in a clearly outdated design. This approach was opposed by factory engineer Witold Kreszczuk. Although he held a lower formal position than Lipgart, Kreszczuk was responsible for introducing the Gaz 011 into production at the Gaz plant. He wrote several letters to the Ministry of Automotive Industry, the Council of Ministers, and directly to the Kremlin, addressed to Stalin, sharply criticizing Andrei Lipgart. Unfortunately, history has not preserved any photographs of Kreszczuk, but it was these denunciations that became the turning point after which Lipgart's career at Gaz was effectively broken. The Ministry of Automotive Industry chose not to examine the conflict in depth and sided with Kreszczuk. In December 1951, Andrei Lipgart was removed from his position as chief designer of Gaz and sent to work in the distant Ural city of Myas at the Ural ZIS plant. There, since wartime, the factory had continued producing primitive ZIS 5 trucks with wooden cabs, and the enterprise was widely regarded as lagging behind the rest of the industry. Kreszczuk later distinguished himself in a similar way during his time at the Moskvich plant. When the factory was working on the APA-7 airfield starting unit, another denunciation from Kreszczuk was sent to senior authorities, this time against the plant's chief engineer, Viktor Polyakov, who would later become Minister of the Automotive Industry of the USSR. No repressions followed in Polyakov's case, but he reportedly spent considerable effort and nerve defending his position. However, every story has another side. Let us take a sober look at what consequences Kreszczuk's letters and Lipgart's subsequent dismissal actually had for Soviet automobile engineering. Was everything really so straightforward? Perhaps the main positive point is that the worst did not happen. Lipgart did not go from the post of chief designer at Gaz to the labor camps of Kolyma. Instead, he was sent, albeit with a serious demotion, to another automotive plant. After several years working at Ural, Lipgart returned to Moscow, where he continued to hold senior positions at NAMI for many years. He remained active as an engineer, supervised work at several factories, and took part in meetings of the Collegium of the Ministry of the Automotive Industry of the USSR, effectively influencing which vehicles the country needed and which it did not. Can this outcome be called the collapse of his career? Clearly not. For Gaz itself, Lipgart's departure was not fatal either. The last vehicle developed with his involvement, the Gaz 69, entered mass production after his removal, was transferred to the Ulyanovsk automobile plant, and went on to enjoy a long and successful life on the assembly line. Moreover, it became the basis for the first generation of the UAZ 450, better known as the Bukhanka. Most importantly, it was already without Lipgart that full-scale work began on a new generation passenger car, the M21. The first layout drawings and mock-ups of the future successor to the Pobeda had appeared while Lipgart was still at Gaz, but they looked rather ordinary, essentially a scaled-down Zim or a typical early 1950s foreign sedan. The new chief designer of Gaz, Nikolai Borisov, gave the lead engineers of the M21 project, Vladimir Solovyov and Alexander Nevzorov, as well as body designer Lev Yeremeyev, complete creative freedom. The result of their work was the Gaz 21 Volga we all know today. Andrei Lipgart himself spoke of the Volga extremely harshly. Contemporaries recalled that he called it ugly and poorly engineered, contrasting it with what he considered the excellent Pobeda and describing the Volga as a monstrosity created at Gaz without him. Reconstructing Lipgart's exact motivations and fully documenting all of his technical criticisms of the Volga is difficult today. Yet the overall picture is quite clear. Had it not been for Krashchuk's letters and Lipgart's removal from the position of chief designer at Gaz, the Gaz 21 Volga, at least in the form we know so well, would most likely never have existed at all. It is quite possible, however, that Andrei Lipgart's harsh words about the Volga also contained a degree of personal bitterness. He was a first-rate engineer and, understandably, took his dismissal and de facto exile very hard. Yet even in his new position, Lipgart quickly proved his high level of professional skill. As mentioned earlier, the Ural plant continued to produce openly archaic wartime trucks, while the country's leading automotive factories had already switched to more modern designs such as the Zis 150 and the Gaz 51. Nevertheless, no matter how backward the plant was, it still had its own engineering staff. In 1949, they built and submitted prototype versions of a new truck for testing at NAMI. When Lipgart arrived in Mias from Gorky, he was shown the drawings of this vehicle. After a brief review, he immediately went to inspect the prototype itself, measured it with a tape measure, and that very same day sketched a revised layout that increased the cargo bed capacity without changing the vehicle's overall dimensions. He then thoroughly explained to his Ural colleagues how the engine and chassis should be redesigned. Using his remaining connections at Gaz, Lipgart secured the transfer of tooling for the Gaz 51 cab to Mias. At the ministerial level, he also managed to push through a decision to replace the completely obsolete Zis 5 with a new model. Yes, the Ural 355M did not stand out for technical novelty, but in the end, it proved to be an excellent workhorse for provincial and remote regions, of which the Soviet Union had no shortage. The truck featured a reliable and durable engine that tolerated low-quality fuel and oil while remaining relatively economical. Its chassis was extremely simple and nearly indestructible, and the cab obtained by Lipgart was fitted with the warmest heater among Soviet trucks of the time, a feature drivers especially appreciated in severe winter conditions. Finally, the Ural 355M achieved a very successful balance between its own weight and payload capacity. Production of this unaesthetic but inexpensive, reliable, and practical vehicle ended for only one reason. Ural was reoriented toward the production of three-axle military trucks. So when you look at it closely, a denunciation against one of the Soviet Union's best automotive engineers ultimately gave the country two successful and genuinely popular vehicles, one passenger car and one truck. As already mentioned, Andrei Lipgart's career overall turned out relatively well despite this deeply unpleasant episode. He lived until 1980 and passed away at home at the age of 81. On his gravestone, the word Pobeda was engraved, a symbol of what was arguably the most important automobile of his life as a designer. The career of the man who wrote the denunciation, Witold Kreszczuk, is much harder to describe as successful. Even before his conflict with Lipgart, colleagues often criticized him for low competence and a lack of genuine engineering skill. In the end, Kreszczuk was transferred from Gaz to the position of chief designer at the Lviv bicycle factory, a move that, to put it mildly, looked far more like a demotion than a step forward. To conclude this story, it is worth returning to the fate of the amphibious vehicle, the very machine that triggered such a dramatic turn in Andrei Lipgart's career. I will explain how it all ended, and you can simply imagine the emotions of a man who, because of this project, was removed from his position, demoted, and sent to work at a provincial factory. A state commission, dispatched to the plant with a delay only after Lipgart's dismissal, came to exactly the same conclusions Lipgart himself had reached earlier. Developing a clearly outdated design and maintaining production of equally obsolete components from the Gaz 67 was deemed impractical. Instead, the commission recommended the Gaz 46, developed by Lipgart's team, for serial production. In the end, one of the country's finest automotive engineers was effectively punished for initiative and for plain common sense.